President Obama set to meet with some of the biggest names in business and technology in California. Among them, Facebook creator Mark Zuckerberg, Apple's Steve Jobs, and Google's Eric Schmidt. Should be some interesting conversation, especially given our headline of the day. From the Wall Street Journal, Google elbows Apple, woos publishers. Google firing back at Apple by starting its own payment system for digital content. And for content providers, it's much cheaper.
Which brings us to our today's Digital Life segment, the clash of the titans, Google versus Apple. More insight now on the story from our guests, Quentin Hardy with Forbes and David Carnoy over at CNET. Quentin, let me start with you. The way I see this is both companies have started digital newsstands, and Apple says, sure, you can put your magazines on our newsstand, but we want a 30% cut. Google says you can put it on our newsstand, we'll only take a 10%. Quentin, what do you think? Has Apple gone too far? Are they asking too much?
Have they gone too far? It really depends on whether or not they get away with it. Now, Apple has done such a good job just orchestrating these ecosystems of music people for the iPod and now content people for the iPad. That has a lot to do with Steve Jobs' ability to negotiate with these guys. He's not on the spot right now, may not be for a while. I wish him well, but there you are. And Apple comes out and says, we'll take a 30% cut. You can't price lower anywhere else than where we're selling, and we get all the data on who buys it. Google, they don't depend on any of that stuff. They just live off advertising, and they say, we'll take a 10% basically to run our fees.
Is Google going to force, is Apple's ecosystem strong enough, or does Google force them to cut prices?
I think Google forces them to cut prices. I think Apple backs off.
Mm-hmm. David, when I read what Eric Schmidt had to say about this is all about altruism. This has nothing to do with Apple,
oh, really?
Apparently. Mr. Carnoy, Mr. Schmidt says that the reason they're only accepting 10%, they just want to cover their costs, and they want the publishers to make all the money. Do you believe that, or is this really about striking back at Apple?
I mean, it's definitely a battle between two Goliaths, and really it's about making sure you have the content to support the devices. And right now, Apple, just with the iPad, really is so far ahead. There are now Android tablets coming out, but they have such a small part of the market, and that's really with the iPad 2 coming out in April probably, they're just going to have more and more of the market. So that's really, right now, Google is just trying to drive a wedge between the publishers and Apple to try to gain some ground going forward.
Cheaper price, basically.
Yeah, is there anything, Quentin, that says that you can't serve up your content on both platforms?
Well, you can if you write to both and agree to Apple's terms. I think Apple's a little bit.
And why wouldn't I want to do that if I'm Forbes magazine and I want to get some revenue? If I've got to play on Apple's playing field because they have the dominant share in the tablet market, and I also want to play on Android's playing field because they're a comer here, why wouldn't I choose to be both places?
Well, don't kid yourself. It's not cheap to develop these things, and it's really not cheap to develop a good winner. You launch them, and you really don't know how well you're going to do. You got this huge pipeline of content you got to continually reformat. How much money can you make off that? It's unclear.
You know, Quentin, though, you said that you think that Google is basically going to force Apple to cut its prices. I can't recall when anybody forced Apple to do anything. How do you think that's going to play out?
Well, I don't recall anything lasting forever, including Apple's grandeur.
That's true.
And Google has this wonderful technique. I wrote about it a couple weeks ago. I call it outsourcing taste. They just go with a million different developers out there in the world who work for them. One of them comes up with something wonderful, maybe as wonderful as Apple's own wonderful in-house design. And, just all it takes is one or two of those to go really well. They got to hit product. It's a got-to-have-it tablet, at which point the iPad is just one more device.
Guys, we would be remiss if we didn't ask you about these headlines that we're hearing from some of the tabloids that suggest that Steve Jobs is iller than maybe we originally thought. David, what are your thoughts on this? What are you hearing, the implications for Apple?
Well, I mean, I think it's always going to be an issue going forward with how sick is Steve Jobs. One time we see him, a report that he's very healthy. I mean, there's going to be a lot of spin with this. I mean, I think the bigger issue though with this, the App Store with Apple is that it's talking about taking a cut of all content.
Right.
So that's really the biggest issue going with Amazon and ebooks to a certain degree with the magazines and the newspapers, those digital subscriptions. That's not the big deal.
Quentin, you are the bureau chief, Silicon Valley bureau chief for Forbes. What are you hearing about Steve Jobs?
It's not great. Death will come for us all, and what a life. The problem for the company, I think, gets back to this ecosystem thing.
Sure.
You have to be such a great negotiator to make the record companies dance on a beach ball the way he did, to make AT&T line up for the iPhone the way he did. To
yeah,
make
to
the
Sue's point earlier, nobody's ever made Apple do anything. He makes everybody do
What a great
everything.
negotiator.
Right.
They're trying to do it now with TV. Without him, can they make all those guys line up?
Which is why we wish him very well.
I think
but
the
CNBC
fear factor
will never cave to him. Quentin and David, thank you so much for your time. We're still going to maintain our